All right, in order to stay on schedule, we would like to start this next session. This one is going beyond the campus to talk about the impact of anti-Semitism on American Jews, their view of themselves, their view of their standing in society, etc. And we have the two best possible people to be presenting to us on this, and to field your questions afterwards. We won't be doing the cards in this session. You'll just be recognized from the table here to ask questions when that portion of the session arrives. So it's my very happy task to be introducing our two presenters. So first, the visiting team. Professor Pamela Nadell, who holds the Patrick Clenenden Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University in Washington, D.C. Her bachelor's degree is from Douglas College at Rutgers University, MA and PhD from Ohio State University, and her book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year. A National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Award has been supporting her current book project, which is Antisemitism, an American Tradition. This is about to come out, yes?
No?
Not quite? Okay. Anyway, she is past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. She consults to the museum that is being planned for the rebuilding of Pittsburgh's Tree of Life and productions of the play The Lehman Trilogy. And she was the fourth witness in the congressional hearing with the university presidents. Often forgotten, I guess, but important. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to have her here.
Thank you.
And now the home team. This is Chancellor Shuly Rubin Schwartz, who is the 8th Chancellor of JTS and also the Irving Lehrman Research Professor of American Jewish History. She was one of the first women on the JTS faculty, played an instrumental role in introducing Jewish gender studies into the curriculum. As Dean of the Albert List College of Jewish Studies, which is as you know, our undergraduate dual degree program with Columbia University and double degree program with Barnard College. Later as Dean of the Gershon Kex Graduate School, and later beyond that as Provost, she has played a central role in shaping and strengthening JTS's academic programs while teaching and mentoring countless students, and I would add countless colleagues on the faculty and in the administration, all of whom feel privileged to be working with her. She is a groundbreaking scholar of the modern Jewish experience. Chancellor Schwartz is the author of The Emergence of Jewish Scholarship in America, the publication of the Jewish Encyclopedia, and The Rabbi's Wife, the Rebbitzin in American Jewish Life, the latter of which was awarded also the National Jewish Book Award. It's a pleasure to be introducing Professors Nadell and Schwartz for this session on the impact of anti-Semitism on American Jews.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tucker. Okay, so this is, I guess, one of the privileges of being Chancellor and having a little say in what this looks like, that you get to invite your friends and then be in conversation with them, only now you get to listen in. So Professor Nadell, Pam, and I go back to our graduate student days. As you have heard, we are both American Jewish historians. Then we were young graduate students, and we first met on a research jaunt in Cincinnati at the American Jewish Archives. I remember vividly, we were talking about what year it is, but I remember vividly because I left my 14-month-old daughter at home. I had to wean her to go, to go away for 10 days. My daughter, who is now living in Israel. And I was researching the work that would become my dissertation. I imagine you were as well. We did not write about anti-Semitism, and we will talk a bit about that, about what our training was like. Anti-Semitism was certainly not front of mind. And yet we've been talking, consulting, collaborating, and just, I don't know, for me, grateful to have a trusted colleague for so many decades. And it's really a privilege to have you here and to now be in conversation around anti-Semitism and allyship. We'll, of course, get to it later for you to tell us how you came to write this book. But when we thought about what we would do today, you know, we've spent now 2 days talking about the history of anti-Semitism, the religious roots of anti-Semitism. We heard about the limits of free speech and how that impacts anti-Semitism. And of course, this morning we heard about what's going on college campus, of which you did need to listen. At American University, you know this well, and this is what we are living now. But the world in which we were trained and the campuses on which we served earlier in our career, feels like a different universe from where we are today. And one of the things we want to explore together today is how that impacts, well, for us, the way we as historians think about American Jewish history and the role of anti-Semitism in that history, where it fits in the mix. And we've been talking a lot about, well, in the last session, specifically, how does it feel to be on campus? Do we feel safe? Do students feel safe? But how does it feel collectively as American Jews think about where are we in this story? Where were we in this story? How did we understand ourselves in this story as Jews in America? And how is that changing just in the last 6 months?
Right. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. When we began talking about what to do, I said, I don't really want to give a talk. There are lots of talks. I said, you and I have been in conversation for over 40 years. We should just continue the conversation, and hopefully people would enjoy that. And also, especially thinking of the students who are here, hopefully you're making friends that you're going to be in conversation with for the next 40 years. So I thought that would be like fun to see. But I mean, you're absolutely right. We didn't talk about anti-Semitism. We didn't need to talk about anti-Semitism. You were writing about the encyclopedia, which of course obviously had lots of material in it on anti-Judaism and eventually on anti-Semitism. And I was back then writing about how Jews literally came to America from Eastern Europe, which of course they were doing either because of, as Shaul was saying, structural anti-Semitism in terms of where they could live, what they could earn, or often ignited by the pogroms. But mostly they really came because of structural anti-Semitism that limited their lives. But anti-Semitism wasn't our focus, and it wasn't our focus because we were part of a generation that was taught that America was different, that it was exceptional. And I don't feel that way any longer, but the historian the great historian of anti-Semitism in American history, Leonard Dinerstein, he wrote his book in 1994. And what he did in his book is he actually wasn't really interested in the impact of anti-Semitism on Jews. He was interested in chronicling where anti-Semitism had surfaced. He showed it surely had surfaced. But then In 2000, there's a historian who wrote a book called The Death of American Anti-Semitism. It was like over. And Dinerstein, both in 2012 and again in 2016, at the very beginning of 2016, he published something where he said, and I'm going to just quote it, he said, "The plague of anti-Semitism, most American Jews don't see it, feel it, or hear it." And then he said, anti-Semitism is too minor an issue to disturb the daily lives of American Jews. So what that proves is that historians know a lot about the past, maybe a little bit about the present, and absolutely nothing about the future.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It is true that when I was researching the history of the publication of the Jewish Encyclopedia and then writing the story of its publication, I was thinking about Jewish scholarship's emergence and then transference from Europe to America. But of course, what is the longest article in the Jewish Encyclopedia? The longest article in the Jewish Encyclopedia is the Dreyfus Affair. So while this is a work of scholarship, the trauma of 19th century European anti-Semitism, it pervades the encyclopedia. And in a way, that feels to me very much the way I understood the role of anti-Semitism here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I made my scholarly career as well as my academic administration hat, because we were so influenced by Selo Baron, who has come up in conversation several times over these past 2 days, the eminent historian at Columbia, the second chair in Jewish studies in the United States after Wolfson, right, at Harvard. And, you know, he was famous for arguing against what he coined the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, that Jewish history is one tale of woe after another, one calamity after another, and he was determined to change that narrative. And I would say that we all grew up in that shadow. We at JTS were determined to teach everything but those tales of calamity and woe. We were going to show how Jews lived, not how Jews died. We were going to show the richness and breadth of the Jewish experience, of Jewish literary productivity, artistic productivity. I personally, well, of course, 1 week in any survey course would certainly focus on anti-Semitism, but I didn't teach a course on anti-Semitism till 10 years ago and not before. And while it was taught before, generally speaking, I think the feeling was, certainly for me, sitting in the history department, it was like, well, Jews coming into JTS, if they know any Jewish history, they know about the Holocaust. We don't need to teach that here. Now we do.
What's so striking in terms of like this historical development is that after Dinerstein and that bad book, The Death of American Anti-Semitism, when I would look for other books on the history of anti-Semitism, they were always written by American historians, not by American Jewish historians. And I actually think that's the key to understanding his book. So he was sort of standing on the shoulders of scholars like John Hyam, who called anti-Semitism that emerged at the end of the 19th century social anti-Semitism. And social doesn't have like the connotations that we think of. And he was, and Hofstadter, Richard Hofstadter, he was standing on his shoulders And he wrote about, well, it was only from a particular political movement from the late 19th century called the Populists, which you can ask questions about if you want to know anything more about that. But then when I looked for more recent works, so there are more recent works, but they're written by scholars who were not trained like we were. So we were so influenced by Baron and not writing the Lachrymose Conception, but we never bothered to look at what he really said, which is that the Lachrymose Conception was to pertain to the Middle Ages and didn't pertain to the American Jewish experience, and or obviously 20th century Europe. So it just really shaped how we thought about it. And what you were saying about the Dreyfus Affair being the longest article in the Jewish Encyclopedia, I didn't remember that from your book, but American Jews, they viewed the Leo Frank affair, they called it their Dreyfus Affair. And I can keep finding subsequent references to when something else happened in the political sphere, that it's the American Dreyfus Affair. Really influenced. That's the whole thing about understanding anti-Semitism for American Jews is you can't just look at America, you have to look overseas, you have to look at the rest of the Jewish world.
Right. What my colleague, Benjamin Gampel, whom you heard from yesterday, who also was trained in this same vein, said that one of the reasons that Baron discounted that for the current period is that he didn't think the history of persecution would appeal to young Jews. So I'm not sure that it was the scholarly perspective, but really like how is the Jewish story going to get carried forward, and how are we going to kind of build on the sense of pride and grounding of young American Jews?
It's so amazing that you mentioned Gampel, because he works on Spanish Jewry and the Inquisition, and the references that I find from American Jews in earlier periods, they're talking about the Inquisition. You know, until we get to the Dreyfus Affair, then it switches. So I've got these other kind of reference, and obviously, as we see today, you know, the Holocaust gets referred to.
Right. So I want to ask you about that, coming from a secular university in your career, the role that that course on the Holocaust played in Jewish studies offerings over the decades.
So when I got to American University, I was actually the only faculty member who was doing Jewish studies full-time. And I said to my colleague, Richard Breitman, who's a distinguished historian of the perpetrators of the Holocaust, and I said to him, I never, ever want to teach Holocaust. I'm not trained in it, that's not what I do, and actually when I was in grad school, I was away the year that they offered the course, so I don't know it. And then, and then at some point, he said, I can't do it. I teach Nazi Germany. It's a conflict. So I said, okay. This was like the 90s, I think. I mean, I've been at AU for over 40 years. And I went to teach Holocaust. And I discovered, and I continue, it's now part of my regular rotation. I teach it every year. Is that I had actually spent my entire life preparing to teach Holocaust, because I would go back to like the books that I read in 8th grade when I obviously had read the Diary of Anne Frank, but at that point I really didn't know a whole lot about the difference between historical fiction and history, right? So you know, James Michener's The Source, of course, but you know, John Hersey's The Wall, Leon Uris's Mila 18, and then I just had spent a lifetime reading about the Holocaust. And so I teach it, but I also keep changing it because the amount of scholarship pouring out on the Holocaust is unbelievable, right? Every time I turn around, I have a new book to recommend, a new one that also is about the Holocaust called Time's Echo by Jeremy Eichler. It's the one I'm in the middle of right now. It won 3 National Jewish Book Awards, including the top prize. And it is about how 4 composers, including Schoenberg and Britten, memorialized the war and the Holocaust. And he's a music critic for the Boston Globe. It's stunning, unbelievably stunning, but depressing.
Oh. So I think that, picking up on the way we responded to Baron, I guess, and thinking historically about the role that anti-Semitism played, and in some ways, it's the undertone of a lot of what has come up in the sessions. There are ways of addressing anti-Semitism that are about directly countering charges against Jews and fighting for against quotas or against housing restrictions. And I think historically about ways in which we take anti-Semitism on directly. And then I'm thinking about anti-Semitism in this country in the 30s and 40s, which, again, yeah, we kind of jump from the Dreyfus affair to the Leo Frank case to the Holocaust. And what about all that space in between? And how do we respond?
Right, and also how JTS responded, because what we have essentially from the 20s to, actually, it's really after the war, it doesn't end in 45, is we have what people have always called the high tide of American anti-Semitism. And I've actually been saying, I told you this for a while, I'm really wondering if we are now living through the high tide of American anti-Semitism, or we're gonna have to rename that era. But what we have in that era is what you're referring to. We have entire industries. The largest industry in the United States is the American Telephone and Telegraph. They don't hire Jews. We have 75% of the ads in Chicago newspapers in the 1920s for secretaries, which was the highest job a woman could achieve if she wasn't a teacher. And mostly they were doing the teaching in New York. They read Gentiles only or Christians only. They can say that. And that's when the university quotas come in, and they don't fall for a long time. There's the perception that they all fell right after World War II. Did not happen. In fact, Deborah Lipstadt has actually written about the ambassador and special envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism, wrote about that growing up in New York in the early 60s. She knew that there were certain colleges that were simply off limits, that she would not be able to go to those schools. So it persists for a long time. And restrictive covenants that prevent people from buying houses. So it gets the name the high tide of anti-Semitism because of those structural barriers, but at the same time, there are also 100 anti-Semitic groups in the United States in the 1930s, and they only get shut down when the war breaks out because they're seen as seditious, because some of them were funded by the Nazis.
Yeah.
So what about GTS in those years?
Yeah, so, when I think about this, I think about the many initiatives that Chancellor Louis Finkelstein innovated during this period. He takes over in 1940. He's kind of unofficially already in the saddle in the late 30s, because Cyrus Adler was in Philadelphia. It's interesting. I'm not sure how he would understand or interpret the word allyship, but what he was doing, I would say, was laying the soil so that allyship could be possible someday. He felt that the most important thing he could do would be to educate Americans about Judaism, to help Americans understand Jewish values and how it maybe even might have something to say to American life, and then to help educate Jews, to so that they could feel proud about their Jewishness and about their heritage in a country that was such a Christian country that it was not, it wouldn't have naturally happened without specific initiatives. And so we heard from Rabbi Tucker yesterday and others. He created the Institute for Interreligious Understanding. He also created that conference on science, philosophy of religion, and this was his way of beginning to lay the groundwork for interfaith conversations and also to bring in individuals from all walks of life, because he understood, and it's a fascinating insight, in the early 40s, he wanted to strengthen the moral and spiritual fiber of the American people. And he actually said that he saw as part of all that was going on in society, although he never used the word anti-Semitism, but he described it as an absence of idealism, a lowering of moral standards in post-war America, and he said that that would lead to the proliferation of anti-Semitism. He understood that if people didn't interact with Jews, if they didn't know anything about Judaism, it's much easier to other, as we have said over and over again, it's much easier to other the other if you don't know them. And so these institutes, and then he created the Eternal Light series. And there, you know, the allyship was NBC Broadcasting, the broadcasting network, that took a chance on this idea and said, okay, we'll slot you in on Sunday morning when, I forgot what it was called, the Sunday Ghetto, because nobody really wanted to listen to radio on Sunday, and it turned out to be an enormous hit. Started in '44 and continued for 40 years, educating Americans about Jews and Jewish values. It was a little anecdote. Most broadcasting at that time were church services that you could just, you know, live broadcast. What we do now, post-COVID, right? You just can zoom into a religious service. So this was done on radio, and but the Eternal Light series were dramatizations, and so it gave a whole other way for people to access stories about biblical figures, about events in Jewish history, and, you know, that really went a long way to, as I say, to really lay the groundwork for what came later.
What so jumps out at me is that what Louis Finkelstein was doing, remember my first book was on the conservative movement, and what he was doing was he was really part of a movement in the late 30s and the 40s that was about that anti-Semitism is bad for the Jews, but it's really bad for America. Right. And that if we don't educate Americans, then our democracy is endangered. And I think what happened, at least what I see have happened from the 80s, 90s and forward, is that the solution was the way you educate about Jews. That's not the solution. You educate about the Holocaust. And so I actually once asked the Holocaust Museum if they could give me a list of all the Holocaust museums and memorials that were in the world. And at that point, they couldn't even do it. Maybe they have it now. But, you know, the building of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, the opening of the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown, which had been planned in New York, actually, like going back into the end of the 1940s, but just didn't happen. And then all the Holocaust education, not only that happens in the museums, but today there are like 20 states that mandate Holocaust education. And if that was supposed to be the solution to stopping anti-Semitism, it has abysmally failed.
abysmally, right. And he intuitively understood that. I mean, and his successor. I mean, one of the most popular episodes when the Eternal Light went to television, in the television era, was another of my predecessors, Chancellor Gerson Cohen, on site in Spain, walking everyone through the remnants of the areas in Spain that was the birthplace of the Golden Age of Spain, which we've talked about, right? This convivencia, this moment of collaboration between Muslims and Jews that led to enormous creativity in literature and philosophy, in the arts, poetry. And this is what JTS wanted to focus on, not the Holocaust, right? And so let's point to these moments where it works, and rather than focusing on, you know, the most horrific example of anti-Semitism.
But he skipped over the Inquisition jails, I bet.
That's right.
Yes. So it's so interesting, I mean, that you talk about, like he was talking about the Golden Age, because everybody's been talking about the Franklin Foer article. The Golden Age of American Jews is ending, and the first thing I can tell you, I was in conversation with him already, and I did say this publicly.
And you survived.
Yeah, I survived. But I also said it publicly, he's not a historian, so he doesn't really understand periodization. But the bigger issue is to take us back to Dreyfus. When do Jewish historians talk about the Golden Age? They invent it in the wake of the Dreyfus affair. And they do it because their times are troubled, and so golden ages are something that we kind of retroject back. And it wasn't a golden age. I mean, it was a golden age of creativity, absolutely. But Maimonides, you know, everybody talks about, you know, Maimonides is a towering figure of the golden age, except that nobody remembers that he had to flee Spain, his birthplace, and wander across Spain and North Africa for a decade.
We all got to hear from Dr. Gampel yesterday, so
Yeah.
we know very well. There were golden moments
Right.
in that age, and then Jews had to flee.
Right. It's
Or got
expelled. Kind of astonishing. So I'm curious. I mean, you were talking about, you know, about your work, your earlier work, but growing up in the 50s and 60s, did you ever encounter anti-Semitism?
Not knowingly. I mean, I did go to a Jewish day school, so I didn't encounter it in school. Until I went to public high school, and by then, you know, it was the 60s, late 60s, and so it was a very different climate there, where difference was celebrated. I even went Afro by then, and that was okay. But no, what I did experience, because my father was a congregational rabbi on Long Island, I did experience his concerted effort to advance interfaith relations. And that was an era, very Catholic area, and there were several Protestant churches as well in town. And when my father came to this new suburban community that was just potato farms until the 1950s, he was able to, the Catholics and Protestants came together because now there was a Jew. So then they could get along. And I remember that kind of common cause in working within the school system. I remember the interfaith Thanksgiving services that were a really important symbolic moment of acceptance for Jews in suburbia in that period of time. I remember one of the Protestant ministers with whom he became close coming to a Passover Seder. So those were, again, an awareness of the necessity for allyship, and I would say a genuine appreciation that other religious leaders were natural allies when you were hoping to bring religion to suburban America.
Right. And of course, it's the moment where there's a religious revival in America in the 50s and the early 60s. So that makes some sense.
How about for you?
When I look back, there were two, like when I was very young and we lived in one place that was a brand new suburb, which would not have had a restrictive covenant. There were two Catholic families lived across the street, and they had lots of kids. And I do remember at one point somebody saying something like, "You killed our Lord." And then I went and asked my parents. I'm not sure they were able to explain why that was incorrect, but so I remember that, and I remember, what I remember actually is somebody who went on to become a rabbi, and who tragically died very young, and I remember him fighting for matzah in the cafeteria over Passover. And by this point I was living in Livingston, New Jersey, a town that was like we used to say, a third Jewish, a third Catholic, and a third Protestant. And it was actually, by the time they broke down Essex County, it was actually more than a third Jewish. And he ended up getting the nickname Matzah from that. So what I remember is this kind of, and it was the 60s already, so this kind of activism, but also that you had to be active to assert your Jewish identity, even someplace like that was so open to Jews. But I bet that township had restrictive covenants before the 60s.
Yeah, I think I was vaguely aware of Jews wanting to be in a certain country club that wasn't open. So, like, I was vaguely aware of that, but I was too young to, it didn't register. It was like, okay, then you go somewhere else. So it didn't impact me. I didn't personally experience it at all in high school. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was the remnants of that structural anti-Semitism from the earlier periods. What really jumps out at me, though, is how people remember those events years and years later. And I, right after October 7th, I was actually in a conversation that Rebecca Coburn, I know she was here yesterday, that she organized to talk to the students. And I said that what actually drew me into the book that I'm currently writing is that I first thought that I would write about gender and anti-Semitism because nobody had written about that, and I've published, it's online, I've published an extended talk about that. But then my agent and my editor said, no, you should really write about anti-Semitism writ large. But I would be on book tour with America's Jewish Women before, live before COVID hit, and I started to ask people to share stories, like what you and I just did, like, did you ever encounter anti-Semitism? And I would get stories that people would tell me that it happened 50 years before, and they would tell me those stories with as much pain as if they had happened yesterday. And I'm seeing all these nods, and so after that book tour was cut short, and I went on Zoom, I would still do it, and after every Zoom talk, I would say, send me a story, and I have a folder filled with stories that go way, way down through the 20th century and into the 21st. Anti-Semitism is a through line in the American Jewish experience.
So I think maybe I'd like to hear more about your experience in the classroom over these past decades, because, we heard a lot in the earlier session about how the how part of what we're experiencing on campuses now, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism, is all caught up with this colonialist, white, supremacist oppressor, oppressed, all of these narratives. And, some of that impacted our fields in the way in which, some of the new ways of interpreting history have impacted the way in which people now, I wouldn't even say try to understand, but more have like set up barriers of like either you're with us or against us. Either you agree with my theory or you don't agree with my theory. And
It's
how'd it go down for
yeah.
you?
I don't find it as big a problem in the history department, but and Shaul, you were getting at this before. There are entire categories, there are entire fields of academia where it's gender and women's sexuality studies, it's anthropology, it's sociology, American studies, there are entire fields where if you do not subscribe to the orthodoxy of that moment, and it's how they're trained. Somebody was talking about Judith Butler earlier. If you don't subscribe to that, then you don't have a place in that field. And the example was that I was actually chair of something we called the Critical Race Gender Culture Studies Collaborative for a year. I know, don't ask.
It's a mouthful.
I know. And it had 5 departments in it, 5 programs in it, and they put me there because I had chaired the history department. They figured I could do a good job there. It was not a good match. And it was the year that I published America's Jewish Women, and I think my colleagues thought, because I had a poster of that on my office door, that made me hostile, because I'm not part of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. I was early in my career when it was women's studies, but I'm not part of that, and we can't do anything about those academic learned societies. When I was president of the AJS back in like 2016, 2017, and I think it was the American Studies Association, yeah, it was, they passed a BDS resolution, and we spent all this time on the board of the Association for Jewish Studies talking about what do we do, how do we respond, and that's been the problem. And this came up earlier today, and certainly you know this. I feel like we are that kid with his finger in the dike, and we are just being reactive, and that's why this conference is so important, because we can't just be reactive. We need to be proactive, actually the way Louis Finkelstein was.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking similarly. It was in gender studies, not in history, that I experienced it also with my book on the rabbi's wife, of like, well, what theory, what's your construct, what camp do you find yourself vis-a-vis gender, not vis-a-vis the history. I don't think we appreciated the impact that could have, and well beyond the particular discipline and the way in which it has reshaped even what scholarship looks like, what is acceptable scholarship, and certainly we have said this before, certainly last night, and in this morning's session, that while we are talking about anti-Semitism, there's another whole story here that is about the future of the academy, and that is equally, I don't know, terrifying. It's equally terrifying. And the incident that sticks in my mind, it's about a dozen years ago. I remember an undergraduate come into my office completely distraught. I'd never seen her like this before, plopped herself down and said, I don't know what to do with myself. I have such white privilege and I don't know how to bear it. It was the first time I heard that expression, and she was in such pain. and you saw the impact of that labeling on a Jewish student, and she had no way to process that and no way to think about, well, she just felt guilty about something, and she just didn't know what to do.
So to go back to the gender studies, I mean, it reminds me of the late Paula Hyman, who of course taught here. And when she wrote her groundbreaking article on the kosher meat boycott, she did that because it was already the 70s and the first generation of scholarship in women's history was emerging, and it completely ignored Jewish women. And of course, a lot of the creators happened to have been Jewish women who subsequently became more sensitive to that. But she figured, what would they pay attention to? What was acceptable was to look at a strike and was to look at, poor Jewish women, right? So maybe the seeds of what you and I faced, and I didn't know that you'd face that with the rabbi's wife. I figured teaching here, you were protected, as opposed to me being in a secular university.
I needed a publisher.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Wow. So you found that, like, when you were trying to publish, the people were turning it down?
Yeah.
That's terrible. That's like really heartbreaking.
It was more that it like blindsided me. Like, I get that, I read that, but what does that have to do with this historical study that I've just written?
Right, and had it been on ministers' wives, you would have had no problem because people have published it.
Probably not.
Right.
Probably not. Yeah. So I know people are curious, and so I do want to set aside some time. We've talked a lot about campus climate. As I told the group yesterday, and as you know, I began this conference with a pre-conference and did have New York City college presidents for a closed-door breakfast before this began. And one of the reasons for the closed door is that, as we heard at the end of the last session, the scrutiny of government on what's going on campuses, it is both Congress, but also here in New York State with Governor Hochul as well. And that concern really has everyone on edge. So you really had a front row seat to that, as we all saw you on TV. So tell us how that came about, and we'd love to know what it felt like in the moment.
So when I testified at the president's hearing, it actually testified the month before at the House Judiciary hearing, and I actually also testified in 2017 in November of that year, so a few months after Charlottesville. And that hearing was also about anti-Semitism on campus. And obviously, anti-Semitism on campus has changed dramatically since 2017. In fact, there's brand new research surveys by Eitan Hirsch from Tufts University that compares data between 2022 and a few weeks after October 7th, and it's skyrocketed since 2022. What people don't understand about these hearings is that they're public performances. So it was very heartening to hear that the president of Columbia is prepared for that. The presidents at that hearing, I don't think were, although I know one of them was briefed by a public relations firm. That what people also don't understand about them is that you submit written testimony. Mine were about 10 pages single-spaced. You have about a few days, sometimes a week, to craft that written testimony because you don't get a lot of notice. And then you have to summarize your written testimony in 5 minutes. And you've got a clock in front of you. 5 minutes is 3 pages double-spaced. So you don't get to say a lot. And then it flips back and forth between the majority party and the minority party, and they each get 5 minutes. Most of the time, They use all of their 5 minutes to make a speech. Every once in a while, they use part of the 5 minutes to make a speech only for 3.5 minutes, and then to ask a question, and then you have 60 seconds in which you can answer. So this is not like your ideal forum for a, a sustained, thoughtful, and civil conversation. That hearing had gone on for almost 5 hours. And during the hearing, the presidents had all been asked a political litmus test. Do you support the existence of the State of Israel? Which they all said they did. They were asked a political litmus test that I don't believe is legal, which is what is the political composition of your faculty? And they were also asked about the size of their endowments. And what this was is unquestionably an attack on higher education. And actually, we were on break for a little while everybody had to go vote on the floor. And while we were on break, one of the legislative assistants said to me, oh, they're not getting any of the traction they wanted out of this. It's going to be great. And then we came back, and Elise Stefanik went viral. And so if you really want to know what was going on in that hearing, I urge you can read the transcript. You don't have to listen to 5 hours, although the number of people I've met who have, it's really shocking. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. The Columbia hearing will get, obviously, a great deal of attention, and there'll probably be other hearings coming as well, I imagine.
Absolutely. So, yes, when we were graduate students, if anyone had asked either of us if we would be writing a book on anti-Semitism, I think you would have joined me with an emphatic no. That I wrote a book on rabbis' wives, and you wrote America's Jewish Women. I'm not sure it was in our heads then. It certainly wasn't in mine, but it's not surprising that we each wrote those books. But when did you decide that your next book project needed to be on anti-Semitism? And when did you decide how you were going to title that book?
How I was going to, yeah. So as I said, so I was on book tour 2019 to March of 2020. And by March of 2020, I thought I'm going to write about gender and anti-Semitism, and that led to my lecture for the University of Michigan called It Can Happen Here Too. And then at some point, I began having conversations. I do have an agent and an editor. I have a fabulous editor at Norton Press. And at some point, they said no, like it's too narrow, as my agent said. He said, men will read this book. So at some point, and the title, I signed the contract like less than 2 years ago, and it was titled Anti-Semitism in American Tradition, A New History. And then my editor said, I'm cutting off a new history. People will be able to figure it out. So I've been writing, I started writing seriously last fall because I wanted to apply for the NEH. And it's 6 chapters. My editors got the first 3. I finished 4. I'm halfway through 5, and I'm hoping I'll finish 6 because I have to go back to teaching in August. I've been on sabbatical. So, yeah.
We wish you luck.
Thank you. I need it.
So we began our conversation talking about, I think you mentioned the idea, and I know it came up yesterday when Rebecca Coburn spoke, about the question of whether American Jewish history is an exceptional history? Is it different in kind from Jewish history? Or does everything that applied before Jews came to this country, the question people ask, could it happen here? And I know we were certainly brought up in our training to think about American Jewish exceptionalism, and you expressed a little skepticism at the beginning. So I wonder, how do you think about it now, and what hope can you offer us?
So the American Jewish experience is different. I mean, but is it so categorically different from, you know, what we've seen elsewhere? So the level of the structure, let's put it this way, the structural things that blocked Jewish life, that actually, when they fell, made Leonard Dinnerstein convinced that America really was different, that it wouldn't return. Those are not going to return again. That's not going to happen again, I hope. But in terms of hope, I guess what I've seen is it's run across American history. There have been times where it's been like pushed to the extremes, pushed to the sides, and maybe we can get to that point again. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I don't think that, look, America is exceptional because Jews didn't have to fight for emancipation here, right? If Jews became citizens because they were living here when the United States was founded, that was already different from any experience that Jews had had anywhere. And I do think that those basic safeguards do make it different. And I agree. I agree with what I think you're saying, which is that anti-Semitism will never go away. But there are times when it's not acceptable for it to be out in public, right? And that's pretty much what happened after the Holocaust. At a certain point, you just couldn't get away with a lot of the asides or snide remarks or quotas or things like that that had existed for much of the 20th century. Just couldn't do that. And I don't know about you, but how many talks did I start this year by saying, I never thought in my lifetime I would see anti-Semitism rear its ugly head as it has now. I would never say it was gone, as the title of one of the books you quoted, right? No, we know too much about Jewish history to imagine anti-Semitism ever disappearing. But when does it become something that is something definable that is, well, we'll just go back to one of the other things we began with, right? Anti-Semitism, when it rears its head, is toxic not only for Jews, it is toxic for democratic society, it is toxic for higher education, it will stifle the things we hold dear as Americans, as well as the things we hold dear as Jews. And that's why it's so important. That's why we're focusing on it today, and why we have to find ways to contain it in such a way that it doesn't destroy everything around it.
Yeah, seems a good note to end on. We should take questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to actually just take questions. So raise your hand, stand up, and we're happy to engage. Mimi.
This is probably a very big question, but as historians have been teaching for a long period of time, how do you look at the events of the last 6 months in terms of how you're going to approach teaching American Jewish history now?
So the question is, as academics who've been teaching for a long time, how is what happened in the last 6 months going to change the way we teach American Jewish history? Well, I mean, we're certainly not going to be able to talk about high water marks as if they're things of the past. Yeah.
It's so hard to know how we'll approach this. I'm actually going to teach American Jewish history again in the fall. I mean, for me, the bigger question is, how am I going to start this book? I mean, at one point, I was convinced that the way I was going to start I always write the introduction last. So at one point I was convinced that I was, it's just like, because you don't know what you're really writing until it's done, right? So I was going to start the book about the day that I discovered that that bomb-sniffing dogs went through my children's Jewish day school every morning before the kids went to school. And my kids, my last one graduated in 2011, so this was going on like, they're 10 years apart, 5 years apart, so it's been going on for, all of the 21st century. And I was thinking, I remember thinking, well, that is very reassuring, but isn't it a bit overkill? And of course, I know it's not. So that's how I was going to start it, but now I need to start with what happened since October 7th. And the one thing I can say is every single day, something else happens that makes me think that's where I should start the book. And that is really terrible, really, really terrible. I think there's one other. Great. Oh, you've got a mic, great.
This institution, I think, among other places, and worked here maybe. Oh, now it's on. Okay. One of the things that struck me was the parallels between history then, vis-a-vis having Israel and then a Jewish diaspora, and now where we have Israel and a Jewish diaspora. And there were times where there were anti-Semitic things going on in the diaspora then, perhaps caused by the fighting in Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering if you thought there might also be some parallels or something we could learn from that period about dealing with what's going on now.
From which period? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking.
The period, Bar Kokhba, I think it's Bar Kokhba's rebellion, and the impact of that on the Jewish communities that were in the diaspora at the time, and the interaction between Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel, et cetera.
Well, I mean, a little bit before Bar Kokhba, there's the massacre of the Alexandrian Jewish community, like 115 to 117. And there's no question that what happens to Jews in one part of the world impacts Jews in another part of the world. So we know that every time there's been some kind of flare-up I'll jump to the modern period. Every time there's been a flare-up in the modern period in Israel, it impacts what happens in the United States. And especially, where was the Gaza incursion of, I forget which year, two springs ago, I think, 2 or 3 springs ago, that led to serious attacks on American Jews. We thought that was like the end of the golden age, right? Instead of Franklin Forward saying 2024. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is just, there's always a connection between Jews in Israel, Jews in the diaspora. I mean, that you cannot separate. And, any attempt to say, well, I'm a Jew, but I have nothing to do with what happened in Israel. That's not the way it works. Whether you want it, even if you would want it to work that way. We are intertwined with one another, and the fate of the Jewish people is intertwined with one another, and it always has been.
Hi, I'm Bethany Horowitz. I have a question as a sociologist, social psychologist. I feel like you're pulling a little too much for a common story about anti-Semitism, and as historians, I want to know how much, you talked about periodicization earlier, Pam, when you were talking about, you mentioned Frank Foer and that he doesn't get it, but sociologically, we can see periodicization, which you mentioned, that in the early part of the 20th century, through World War II at least, there was a lot of evidence of anti-Semitism, and by the time Dinnerstein wrote what he wrote, and I'm not an expert on his work at all, nor am I an expert on anti-Semitism, but when he wrote, there had been a decline that we all lived through if we're baby boomers, when it was at the ebb, not the flow. And you also were mentioning how the definition of anti-Semitism that you're using implicitly, if not explicitly, is about structural challenges and quotas and things that would affect Jews' life chances. So what I'm wondering about is that the differentiation and sort of, I'm wondering, I mean, it's been a theme, and I've only come today, so I apologize, I didn't hear all that went on yesterday. It's become a theme that what we're seeing now is anti-Semitism, if you want to call it that, which I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, I'm just, we put a label on things, but what we're seeing, if we look at what's actually happening, is that it's born out of stuff with Israel, with Zionism, the dynamics there. Is it the same thing? I mean, are we calling it, why are we calling it the same thing, except that we have, as a people, a long narrative of us being, Jews get, killed, whatever's all of our struggles have always had this label put on it, and yet, is this the same thing? Yeah, that's what I'm putting.
Yes. Well, you came in the middle of the story. It's like, as a historian, we did. So, yes, I mean, if you think of what we've been doing for the last 2 days, we began with the historical underpinnings of anti-Semitism, which begin in the Roman period, really in the Hellenistic period, even predate Christianity. And there is a continuum, and what makes it feel unrecognizable today is also what we heard yesterday, and what we know is that anti-Semitism morphs. It is malleable. It is that hatred that can be manipulated and that can morph into different forms, so that it, there is a structural aspect to it, as Shaul talked about, but it's all of these things. It isn't only one, there's no one lens through which to understand anti-Semitism and grasp all of its dimensions. And so, yes, to go back to the question of teaching, when you teach now, you have to talk about things like anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, anti-Israelism. There are new terms, but it's a new generation morphing of there's a reason why it's called the world's oldest hatred.
Yeah, your question is so important, and because the word anti-Semitism is not invented until 1879, so we all know that. But I often find that these are academic conversations, which are very important to have, but for the rest of the world, it's just Jew hatred. I mean, right? It's what, I mean, Jews used to call it vicious. And so, also, because I'm not writing just for an academic audience, I'm just calling it anti-Semitism, and I'm not going to go into a long discussion about the arguments of the various definitions, which frankly are spellings, and well, yeah, I'll probably say something about why I don't have a hyphen, but other than that, yeah, that it is part of the same phenomenon, part of this long history. Yeah.
Hi. I actually want to push back a little bit on this issue of definitions, in that we know there is no universally accepted definition of anti-Semitism. You can go on Google and get 50 different results alone. But in where we are today, especially throwing in anti-Zionism and how, the modern manifestation of anti-Semitism right now is really, really coming out of any lens or anything to do with Israel. Do you think we are at a point in time where we do need to think about leaning into having a more universal definition or understanding of what is and isn't anti-Semitism. Obviously, understanding there's lots of different lenses you can view anti-Semitism through, but where we are today, do we need to change our thinking in that way of trying to come to a communal consensus in order to inform the rest of the world of what is and isn't acceptable by the Jewish community?
So my favorite definition of anti-Semitism, and it's attributed to somebody whose name totally escapes me, is someone who hates Jews more than necessary. And I always teach it to my students. I mean, it's a great, it's a great definition. I would push back a little bit. I mean, I think we're going to continue to have conversations about how we define anti-Semitism, and I actually think that that's very important. But anti-Semitism at the moment is also coming from the right. And the right's construction of Soros being manipulated by Rothschild, and then Soros manipulating the American government in turn, is part of that definition. And the right's attack on Jews as internationalists as opposed to being cosmopolitans, which would have been the attack in the Soviet era, is part of what's going on. And we can't forget that because, those are the people who are carrying the guns. And so anti-Semitism from the right is actually, in many ways, much more dangerous because it is lone actors who believe that Jews should not be alive.
I'll just say, do you imagine there actually us being able to reach a Jewish communal consensus? I don't imagine that happening. And we need to address anti-Semitism now. So, a little more lighthearted response, but I agree with everything you said.
I'll just add, so I started my day on Zoom where I was speaking at a conference at the University of Haifa, and the respondent to our panel actually said that he talked about the Jews going to the moon, and he said, and he was Israeli, and he said, and the minute they get on the moon, they're going to build 2 synagogues, right? The one they go in and the one they don't go in. So, yeah, we're not going to get any consensus. Yeah.
A little related to where you left off, I'm interested in how you see anti-Semitism shifting the American political landscape. Like, I'm a Cuban Jew, so the Bay of Pigs completely turned the Cuban American population into a monolith out of a survival instinct, shifted their political interests away from often what was actually in their best interest, and I'm kind of fearful of seeing that happen now. Like you're talking about it, anti-Semitism is coming in extremes from both ends of the spectrum, so I'm curious your perspective there.
First of all, anti-Semitism, despite the fact that American Jews did not have to fight to be emancipated, but anti-Semitism is actually deeply embedded in various areas of the American government. I mean, the quotas, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, much of it was inspired by the determination that they had to keep East European Jews out. And some of the things that have been said in Congress, and I don't mean now, but in the 1930s, there was a congressman in 1932 began reading the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into the congressional record, needed to be part of the congressional record. So I'm very worried about the political situation and what will potentially happen. I would also like to remind people that the White House issued in May of 2023, not after October 7th, in May of 2023, after conversations, I'm sure you were part of them, with 1,000 Jewish communal leaders, they issued a strategy to combat anti-Semitism. They recognized the danger to America and Americans if we don't respond. But unfortunately, that did not get a lot of play because a whole section of that is about what Congress is supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm Troy Zukowski from Michigan. I'm a Jew by choice, and actually the very first textbook I ever read way back in college was by Jacob Neusner, who's a graduate of JTS and Columbia. During my studies to become Jewish, one thing really struck me. Somebody identified 4 pillars of American Judaism. One was the bar bat mitzvah, the other was Israel, third one was the Holocaust, and 4, philanthropy. Do you agree with that assessment?
What was 4?
Philanthropy. Philanthropy was the 4th one. Those are the pillars that this person identified. Do you agree with that? And do you recommend any additions?
Well, having read Shaul Kellner's new book, what he says is that in the Shaul, you want to grab the mic and say because he. All right. So what he. I thought it was brilliant. I never actually really thought about it this way. Is that we understood the American Jewish community, but Holocaust and Israel were like 2 legs of the pillar, and then you talked about philanthropy, but that fighting for Soviet Jewry freedom, which I remember reading Shaul's book, how you came to brunch at my house with the kids when we went to the rally. In 1987, I know.
Kids remember your dog.
I know, with the Jewish name. Remember that. But that having that move, Shaul, you really should say this so much better than me. But having that focus on essentially fighting anti-Semitism, targeting an entire Jewish community, I actually think kind of like let American Jews off the hook, and they weren't looking at what was happening at home, where there was plenty of anti-Semitism happening at home. But it didn't compare, just like it didn't compare to the Holocaust, just like it didn't compare to the pogroms.
And it didn't fit with the narrative that we wanted to have.
Right, exactly.
And so, then you fit stories into your narrative. It takes a long time before you feel that you need to actually change that narrative. Interesting.
Thank you. Stephanie Sigmund. I know that we're going to have a panel of students this afternoon, but I was wondering from your perspective whether the students, non-Jewish students today on campuses who are feeling and expressing this anti-Semitism since October 8th, where in them personally was anti-Semitism, which was latent in America in various places, but where in these people, these young people who didn't have anti-Semitism as part of their public lives 2 or 3 years ago? In other words, how does it get to them specifically, if not just through this kind of young, instinctive need to participate in the political movement of the day?
Well, I think it gets there through a lot of the rhetoric that we've been saying. If Jews are white, and then Jews have a state, and that state is occupying territory, then you get Jews get equated, white, colonialist, settler, and then, as we heard this morning, and it is absolutely true, and as we talked about when we talked about certain disciplines, the issues on the challenges that higher education faces have been brewing for 20 years, or building for 20 years. The issue of civic discourse, the idea of what is the role of a faculty member? What is the role of a graduate student teaching a section in a course? Are they there to model their views, or are they there to facilitate conversation, right? So all of that has changed, and then that leads young people to be susceptible to just okay, I'm on that narrative and I know what that means, and therefore I know what side of the line Jews fall on. And forget all the nuance of, well, when did Jews become white? They certainly weren't white when there were quotas against them coming into the country in 1924. So that's another construct.
And they also brought it from high school. Remember, the freshmen had only been on campus for a month when October 7th hit. So they had not yet been indoctrinated, shall we say, by the faculty.
Well, and some of that actually already happens in certain high schools, as we have heard from our own students.
I feel like I can also kind of answer that question. I'm a recent graduate of Columbia University. I just finished 7 months ago. And my first program, I did 2 master's degrees, and I did the Master's of Social Work first, and I graduated in 2022. And a lot of the framework that we were taught is based in this idea of, it's called PROP, Power, Race, Oppression, and Privilege. And I have been struggling for a while, personally and professionally, as a social worker now in the world, showing up as clearly a white individual, but also not showing up as a white individual. Also moving through the world with blue eyes and blonde hair. So that is also a challenge for me, but also a lot of the information that we're being taught, especially in the social work field, is fully based in abolitionist social work, which is basically burn it to the ground and start over. So also a lot of the rhetoric about Israel, Jews, Zionism, and all of that is based in abolitionist social work. So I was stepping into spaces with the information around me, about we're colonialists, things like that. And it was really challenging. And for the past 3 years that I've been in New York City, I've been working exclusively with low-income youth and families from the South Bronx. So obviously showing up as a person of privilege, as a white individual, but everyone around me is negating the fact that I'm Jewish. So that was a really challenging thing for me as well. But at the same time, I used the power that I had as a Jewish person with 2 Columbia degrees to teach people and educate people that no, this is not actually correct information. So I think I wouldn't have been able to empower myself and others if I hadn't gotten my Columbia education, but it's also been incredibly infuriating as a recent grad of this university that the information that's being spewed, and I also experienced anti-Semitism in my second program to the point where I was actually screaming at a professor. So if that gives anyone some hope, I was standing up and saying, this is incorrect information that you're spewing, and I had a classmate, we did it together, and if that gives you any kind of hope, but it's been really challenging navigating, as a recent student. But I don't actually have a question, it was just a comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Zooming out a little, if we can kind of go to that exercise, because it's hard to be when we're in this time of urgency. Thinking about the comments you were making, and I was thinking about the thread of culture and sort of the radio show you mentioned and television show that went on for 40 years and how it created this intimacy and knowledge, and thinking about educating people around us. So in your view, what can the history and these moments of hope bring us forward to now and into the future? How can we create commonality and combat anti-Semitism by finding common ground in this moment, to dream big?
I think over the past 2 days we've been talking a lot about the human connection. If there are ways that we can do it using media today, that's not my area of expertise, but certainly we need to get beyond the posturing and the compartmentalizing and the demonizing, and just actually not be afraid to expose ourselves intellectually and emotionally to individuals who hold views different from us. And that's very hard to do right now, because you need everyone to come in with their vulnerability and be open to listening, not only speaking. And that's one of the biggest problems. I mean, I had the privilege to be at the event in which President Biden, Presidents Clinton, and Presidents Obama were all in conversation. And there were, of course, protesters in that moment. And it was President Obama who stood up and said, you know, that's not how it works. You can shout, but you also have to listen.
My hope is that maybe if we can change the culture within the universities so that we can build bridges, restore civil dialogue, that actually in DEI classes we should be teaching how to have civil dialogue, that maybe this generation can take us forward, because at the top it's not happening in terms of the political system. Back to your question about politics, maybe this generation can percolate it up for the future. That's my hope.
Let's hope. But I would also say, having met with this group of presidents, there is tremendous desire and will to, and sense of obligation to the mission of higher education. And so I hope if it comes top down and bottom up, that maybe we can get somewhere.
So we have reached the moment at which we should break. They're built into the schedule as a short break and lunch, which is over at the private dining room. People can show you how to get there if you don't know. And a reminder that at 2 o'clock, we'll have that session with students from the Albert List College, and all of whom are either at Columbia or Barnard, and that'll be well worth coming to and waiting for. And an enormous thanks to these two eminent historians.